One of our real problems is not just military power, it's information power. Look, China did something quite extraordinary. It basically abolished absolute poverty, something that the UN Secretary General, you know, praised China for. And yet, that was not front page news around the world. I'm a enormous proponent of Asianism. In 1947, in Delhi, the government of Jawaharlal Nehru hosted an Asian Relations Conference in 1947. The principal issue of that conference was the independence for Indonesia, the support of Asian countries for the Indonesian people, fight against the return of the Dutch after the defeat of the Japanese in 1948. Asianism is a very compelling idea. And I think that what blocks Asianism today are a couple of things. The first thing is that the United States, and has come to believe this after the end of World War II, that it is the so-called security guarantee for some Asian countries. So the United States military presence around Asia is considerable and dangerous. I'm talking about the bases that run from Japan all the way down to the Straits of Malacca in Singapore. I mean, it's incredible that the United States is not a signatory to the international laws of the seas and yet uses that treaty to conduct so-called freedom of navigation exercises off the coastline, not only of China. I mean, China has it directly in the gun sights, but also Iran. You will remember that US warships, go and dance around the Persian Gulf, threatening the Iranian coastline. So one is the United States, which has utilized its military and economic power to divide Asia, to create blocks from the Manila Pact of 1954, I believe, the Baghdad Pact, and so on. The terrible violence in Indonesia in 1965, which overthrew the government of Sukarno, played an incredible role. That plus the war on Vietnam, these played an incredible role by the United States to divide Asia. That's one author. And we Asian countries need to think about our role in facilitating the US entry. The so-called border dispute could be easily resolved. China and Myanmar solved their border problems in the 1950s. Why has India and China, why have they not been able to solve this problem? Is it seriously territorial? Is it really about Aksai Chin, and is it really about Arunachal? Are these the real issues, or is there something underneath that? And I really feel like we should create some sort of intellectuals forum about the question of the divides between India and China, because this gap, this is a real gap. And I agree with you, economic trade is going to increase. That's inevitable. But these gaps remain. And I think this gap between India and China is, to my mind, one of the principal reasons for the lack of progress on Pan-Asian development. It's the principal reason. It's not to do with South Korea or Japan, or these are petty issues that are provoked by the influence of the United States. In India, we learnt as children about the Chinese travelers that came across the Himalayas. We learnt about Buddhism going to Bamiyan and then eventually into China. We learnt about Rabindranath Tagore and his role, his visits to China. And my grandfather was part of a medical brigade that came to China in the 1920s. We have lots of histories in common, but this gap has to be closed.
Yeah, it's a problem. China has solved the land border disputes with all countries except India and Bhutan. And for Bhutan, it's mainly because of India, because India has a tremendous influence over Bhutan. And between China and India, I agree with you. If we are both broad-minded, we can solve the issue really in a way, conducive to both countries. And yet, on my part, perhaps with slight Chinese bias, the main difficulty is with the Indian side. Mainly, I've been to India 4 times. One is the Indian military, which still has a very strong memory of the 1962 war. Yeah. And the other is India's media. There is always a very strong voice against China. Always. Yeah. And then with India's political system, it's a Western style democracy or whatever you call it. So the media and military always have very strong influence. Now, the Chinese approach is first, as you mentioned, in the history of China and India over thousands of years, in most of the time, we are friends. This border conflict is really minor in the long history between the two countries. The other is let's adopt an approach, what we call the mutual understanding and mutual accommodation. So that's how China solved border disputes with all its neighboring countries, including with Russia. It's different because we have a system which you have a central government led by a Communist Party, which can really have a long vision and plan for the future. Then India's political system is much more full of, how should I say, changes, So it takes really statesmanship rather than politicians to make a decision. If both sides have statesmen, it can be resolved within months.
It's interesting that you mentioned the border between Russia and China, before that the Soviet Union and the PRC. That border dispute was settled only recently, and it was settled pretty quietly. That's what I find interesting. There was almost no fanfare. Well, the border dispute became secondary to the other things that linked China and Russia. The border dispute, in a sense, was not the principal dispute. Once it became clear that China and Russia needed to intensify trade relations, that they needed to have closer security ties, that, when the BRICS was falling apart, when Brazil, India, and South Africa began to move slightly away, all that was left was RNC. And it was a consequence of that made the border dispute irrelevant. In that sense, we need to understand that I think what is going to make the border dispute between India and China irrelevant is what you said earlier: increased trade, increased mutual understanding of benefits. The point you made about the media is a very important point. There is a lack of, I think, generosity about what's happening in different parts of the world. I'll tell you, it's a funny business. We are actually, if I was to look at the numbers, we looked at 2 trillion in military spending. One of our real problems is not just military power, it's information power. Look, China did something quite extraordinary. It basically abolished absolute poverty, something that the UN Secretary General, praised China for. And yet, that was not front page news around the world. That should have been front page news in every newspaper in South Africa, in Algeria, everywhere. No, the West immediately began to say the Chinese numbers are wrong. They are fudging the numbers and so on. So that became the story. Now look at the disadvantage we are at today. And I think that is one of the fundamental problems between a country like India and China, is that most countries in the world have to absorb information and, dare I say it, quote unquote, wisdom from parts of the world which have their own agenda. There is no question that, say, CNN or Reuters or the Associated Press, they are not going to write stories that suggest, the special bond between the Indian and Chinese people. They will write a story and it will be highly inflamed about a dispute that took place somewhere in some mountainous terrain where a
Yeah.
few soldiers died. Let me tell you something that you may not be clear about, that more soldiers, more Indian soldiers die of frostbite up in the glaciers in the borderland region with Pakistan. More so Indian soldiers die of frostbite every year than die from any other reason. Frostbite is the principal killer. Where are the stories about that? I mean, I believe, frankly, and I don't know if you agree with me, but I think that there should be a limit to where you can militarize. If you're talking about the Himalayas, I don't want to put a human being sitting at a border post where they're losing their toes to defend some rocks. I think that that's extremely inhumane to have Indian soldiers and Pakistani soldiers up in the high Himalayas. Western media is not going to do a story that more Indian soldiers die of frostbite
Yeah.
than die of any armed, conflict, because it doesn't suit their agenda. And we accept their media as the real media.
If the two sides can sit down and talk, I strongly believe there will be wisdom from the two sides. For instance, in China's discussion of land or sea border disputes with other countries, we even put forward this idea. Let's put aside territorial disputes, sovereignty disputes. Let's jointly develop this particular disputed region, and they share the profits. So there are all kinds of new ideas we can explore.